David Sable for New York Festivals and Creativity from the Other Side, where we speak with the greatest creative minds in our industry and try to understand what motivates them, what inspires them, what gets them to the great creative that they give to their clients, that they create for themselves, that they create for society. And we try to learn as much as we can from them. And today, I'm so honored to have two new FODs, friends of David, because that's what happens when you come on our little show here. And we have Elliot Scott and Craig Dobie from Applied Design, an incredible design company. We're going to speak a lot about design. We haven't really done a lot around design as a creative center, and I think there's just so much to talk about. But guys, first of all, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
So
thanks for having us.
We'll start with you. First of all, actually, we saw both of you. Both came from Landor.
We did.
And Landor's a company very close to me. I worked with Landor for many years. First and most important question, were you ever on the boat?
I was never on the boat, were you?
I was adjacent to it. I
was adjacent to the boat?
Yeah. I was never actually on it, but I worked at Front Street in San Francisco.
Do you want to tell them about the boat? Tell them about it, because the boat is a really cool story.
So the boat's pretty amazing. I mean, it's myth, but it really was this kind of remarkable thing about Landor, that Walter Landor, who was the founder, as the story goes, was looking to basically get an office for Landor, to house Landor. And somebody jokingly said to him, because the real estate prices were so high in San Francisco, as they still are, they're like, why don't you just buy a boat and put it in the bay? And he said, all right. And so he found a decommissioned ferry boat and actually bought it and brought it to, I think it was Pier 17, I'm gonna get that wrong, but right on the Embarcadero. And that was the corporate headquarters for Landor for, I think, probably 40 to 50 years. It was basically from like the 50s to the 90s that was where it was. And it was, had massive legend, right? So apparently the Grateful Dead played a party there. And
no way.
Yeah.
I didn't know that part, but I was on the boat.
Were you?
The boat was pretty cool, yeah.
So the cool thing is it's actually coming back. So I just read an article,
wow.
I think in the San Francisco Inquirer, that a developer, it moved to the Delta. It moved up to the Sacramento River Delta. I believe a client bought it. It was used as like a corporate retreat, and now it's actually coming back.
So you guys gonna buy a boat?
I'd like to.
You wanna
Get a boat or something? I don't know. What's
I've looked
today's
at barges for like, I can't tell you how long.
Barge is kind of cool. What's today's equivalent? You can get Staten Island ferries, as Pete Davidson's, like really cheap.
Mm-hmm.
Except they tend to sink.
Yeah.
You could build an island.
That's true.
Which is kind of cool. Like,
Get a captain's
I've been
license.
thinking about that. Like, how do you build your own island off of Manhattan? But let's get actually that could be like an interesting design thing. But Greg, you were at Landor, but you also taught, which I found to be really interesting.
I did teaching as a sort of exercise in to find out was I any good at it. I felt I was good at mentoring at work, but I was like, if I did that officially, how would it be?
But you did the opposite, because most people, you know what the adage is, right? Like people who teach can't do.
Right.
But you actually did and taught and did.
Maybe the people that can do can't teach, because I felt a little bit of that when I was doing it. I wanted to change things all the time, and I think to sort of stay the distance as a teacher, you have to just change a few things each semester and not reinvent everything all the time. So it was a disproportionately difficult job because I made it hard on myself to actually. So
what was the biggest learning you took out of teaching?
The thing that really surprised me was there was like a spectrum of students. The sort of students that were sort of not that talented to the students that it was easy for them to do. And what surprised me was, even though I liked the work of the students who found it easy to do, I just wanted to help the people who I could have the most effect on, which were the people who didn't necessarily have the raw talent, but with practice they could get really good and have a vocation in design. And I felt that was the most kind of wholehearted part of my involvement. I was like, this bit I like.
So let's follow that thought down for a second, and then we're going to talk about design just as a discipline and what it does. But can you be, so I think some people think they're designers, they want to be designers, but they don't have real art skills. Can they be designers?
Yeah, I think so. Because I think design, I sort of see it as it's about having an idea in the first place based on the input you're receiving, and then expressing that in some way. Some people are better at having the ideas than they are expressing it. Some people are better at expressing than having the idea. But I think in that spectrum, there's many different kind of jobs and places that you can fill that feel good to do.
So let's talk about
I
design.
was just going to add to that. I mean, I think this is something that makes us a little bit different is like, the thing you have to remember about design, there's a difference between art and design, right? I mean, they're completely intertwined with one another, but design is a commercial endeavor, right? It's the business of making things either communicate what they need to be kind of performing in an aesthetic way. So you can be in design and be an amazing technician who just, your job is to like get that piece of artwork to wherever it needs to go, whether it be digital media or whether it be in prints or whether it be on billboards. I'm pointing over here because I know that there's a fence right below us. And you don't necessarily have to be the best concept designer to do that job. What you need to be is the best technician you can be to make sure that that stuff comes to life true to its intent. And I think that's kind of the cool thing about design, right? There's the concept, which I think everybody thinks about as like kind of the artist, but then there's the other 90%, which is actually getting that thing into the marketplace true to the original intent of the design.
Right, and it could manifest itself to something like you need somebody actually to make the box.
That's right.
Like, so you could conceive it, but then you need somebody who's much more technical.
Yeah.
I guess it's kind of like architects and builders. So architects can conceive a design, but then you have to bring in people actually who understand how to build it and who can make it happen. So let's just talk about the design for a second. There's a couple of things just in the past week struck me, and maybe you can use that just as a sense of design. So I think the thing about design is it has to be practical, or it doesn't have to be anything, but I think the best design is practical, great user experience. It sells the brand. Often it does good. I know that's something you guys like to talk about, and we can talk about that. But you might have noticed, and those people who come from New York, of our listeners and others can look this up. You can Google or Bing it. I always say Bing because Microsoft was a client, so search it, figure it out. Entenmann's was a very famous local New York brand of baked goods. And it was good because it was popular, it was kind of low priced, and shelf life was like for 1,000 years. It was one of those interesting brands. The founder passed away a couple of weeks ago, and as I was reading about him, one of the things, it turns out, was their design sensibility of creating cellophane at the top of the box so you could see what was in it. And that was a huge innovation. So talk about that as a design sensibility. Like what does that mean? Somebody sat there and thought that out, and just how that became the brand.
I think that in pretty much every project of decent size, there is a moment when you realize something important. Like that cellophane window is a disproportionately important idea that they could have had or they could have not had. But there's always a point in the process where there's a moment where you have this sort of, it's kind of like the cliche of the light bulb going off, but you think, is this the thing that we should do? And sometimes that moment, the thing that you realize is obvious, as if it should always been like that, but maybe quite difficult to get everyone else to sort of realize. And there's a little bit of a journey of like, I think this is the right idea. How can I sort of persuade other people it's the right idea, or find out even if it is the right idea? And there's sort of, for me, that moment happens often, and it's just like, it's the sort of turning point in the design process where you're suddenly like, I believe in this thing now. And I think that always happens.
And how much feedback do you need from audiences to get to that idea? So I always think about Apple when it comes out, because if you had asked people about an iPhone, they probably would have looked at you like you had 6 heads. They didn't need one. They never thought of one. If you told them they were going to go like this and go like this, they would have said, don't think so.
Yeah.
And now they do. So how much is design leading us, and how much is design just following us?
That's a great question. I mean, I think what's important, even with Apple and the Entenmann's example, is there was a commercial insight that led to it, right? And I think that when you have that kind of crystallized moment, before you even know what you want to do from a design perspective, it makes it easier to come up with the innovation or whatever this new form is, because it's like you're driving against what that kind of eureka moment was. And I think if I had to guess for Entenmann's, it was like, we need people to be able to see the product, because that's what sells the product. When you see the ooey gooey, I used to, for me, they always remind me of vacation, because we'd always buy them and then we would wake up in a hotel room and the plastic knife would come out and we would eat it.
I was thinking the same thing. There's always a plastic knife.
There's the plastic knife, right? But there was whatever that particular that product was, you would see, the drizzled frosting and all that, and you're just like, you couldn't go buy it. So somebody knew that if you could see that product, that was going to drive somebody to purchase. It was going to entice them to do that. And I also like to think that a lot of the companies like an Entenmann's or an Apple, they were fanatics about their product, right? They're like, we love this product so much, we want you to see it. We know if you see it, you're going to eat it. You're going to want it, and it's going to drive that purchase. Thus, it's like that to the designer is kind of an open-ended brief. Okay, well, the goal is this. We have to package this because it's a packaged good. And trust me on this, our founder is going to tell you, you've got to see the product. And if you're like 50 years ago, you're going, wait a second, but cake boxes are cardboard. How is that going to happen? We have to seal this thing because it's got to ship and all these other. And then somebody was like, put a cellophane window on it, and boom, you've got it. And I think that's kind of the same thing. You can ladder that even to like what Apple does, right? It's like the objective is how do we put an entire music collection in somebody's pocket? Oh, probably further back, it was probably how do we as Apple get into the entertainment business? And then that starts to lead the design, right? And that starts to lead the form function. And I think to your point, it's like, if you were to say that to somebody, people would say you're nuts. But once it's kind of executed against that larger idea, it becomes obvious. You're just like,
so
there it goes.
Let's take that next step. So part of it is to the brand, right? So we want the design sensibility or the design ethos has to extend to everything that the brand does. So let's take Entenmann's, for example, and we'll take Apple for a second example. So in Entenmann's, they put the cellophane window in. But to the point that you made before, this is where now I need engineers and all kinds of other people, because if that cellophane window is porous, or if it somehow causes the product to get stale or dirty, then I blew my brand.
That's right.
And the same with Apple, like everything is clean, even the box. Like I don't know if you ever saw the, Microsoft, as I mentioned before, was a big client of ours, and somebody years ago when the Windows Phone came out, showed what would the Apple iPhone box look like. I don't know if you ever saw that little video. It's brilliant. Yeah. If Microsoft had done it, and so instead of just that nice clean white box with no instruction book in, just like a little thing that says, here, press this and like figure it out, it was like literally covered with mouse time of every caveat in the world. And when you opened it up, there was a user manual this thick. And so totally off-brand for Apple. Sadly on brand then for Microsoft.
Right.
But so talk about that. Like how far do you have to take that design as you move forward? Because I think it's going to come up in our discussion about the World Trade Center.
I mean, I think it goes into every corner of everything if you're doing it right. And also, I think it's, what's the idea? If the idea is sort of big enough, simple enough, it can inform everything. If the idea is not that, then maybe things just happen. They're not done by quote-unquote design. But if you have a simple core idea that sort of transcends the channel, transcends the thing you're designing, it could be how you answer the phone. It determine everything if it's the right idea.
Like a lead pencil. Somebody designed that.
I love it. It's one of my favorite designs. In fact, if you open up my bag, I carry pencils with me.
And nobody's ever improved on it.
No.
You don't have to.
It's all you need, right?
That's all you need. It's kind of brilliant.
I've iterated on it, but nobody's ever really improved on it, right? Just on the basic.
I mean, beyond the mechanical pencil.
Yeah, but I'm saying, but in general, I mean, it is what it is.
It is what it is, but it's actually an amazing example of it appears to not evolve, but it's evolved quite a bit, right? I mean, so in the day, I mean, it was lead, and then it became graphite because of those were human factors, right? I can't poison myself, right? And everybody thinks of lead as being the writing mechanism, but it was lead and paint and everything else. And then all of a sudden you're like, okay, so now we've got to change the paint to acrylic paint. There's manufacturing components to it. We've got to drive this price down on this thing. So what is the material we're going to use? Now, fast forward to where we are today, it's like, how do we sustainably harvest the materials that make this? How do we look at our supply chain, right, to maximize that so we can get down? All of that's design. The pencil didn't have to change, but it's changed tremendously. And that's like a perfect example of design, right? Its form nailed it 100 years ago, and it didn't need to evolve. But it, as a thing, as an object, as somebody's business did, and that's design as well.
All right, so I'm going to ask you each to set a conceptual benchmark for us, and then we're going to talk about two what I think are just two fascinating pieces of work, and we'll really get deep. Okay. Other than what you've done, it can't be something you guys have designed. What is your favorite, like if you had to pick one thing that you thought was just perfect, beautifully designed, incredible. It can be in a product, it could be a look, whatever you think, but absolutely perfect design. So pencil, we said, is one possibility. What would be your benchmark? If you looked at it and said, like, if I could make everything that I did kind of like that.
It's a hard question to answer because what I do isn't what I admire a lot of times. And I'll just give you an example. My favorite art movement is Art Nouveau, and it's as far away from my personal aesthetic as possible, right? Like I couldn't, but that's why I love it. I would say if I could design the thing I hold every day in my hand, and it's funny you said a pencil. I don't know if you read that, but I carry a pencil with me. I love the Bic pencil. Like I don't think you can get any better than what that is, other than it's plastic. Right, and I would love to see it evolve away from being plastic, and I'm sure they're working on that. But that would be the one thing. And strangely, I would say the other thing I hold very dear to me, and I fiddle with it every day because everybody knows I do, is a buck knife. I have this amazing buck knife, and then to me, it's kind of the perfect confluence of like utility, tool, weight, ergonomics, and value. It's not terribly expensive.
Right, I have one too. It's very good.
And they always laugh at me because I'll be on conference calls and I'm start to swing it around, and people are like, "You're swinging the knife around."
Yeah, because you gesticulate.
Yeah, okay. Just do me a favor. Just don't take it out during this.
Yeah.
I don't have like the one thing that I consistently think is the best thing I have or the best design that I've seen. It changes a lot, but it's always something that is maybe very similar to you, is very practical. So like right now, my favorite thing is, you mentioned pencil, it's actually a pen. It's a Flex-On pen where it's made with gel, and you write, but you can erase it. So it looks permanent, so you feel like you're committing to the paper, but you can't actually erase it. And what my favorite thing about it is, it's sort of like magic, because the eraser on the end is just a little piece of silicone. And when you rub the pen, the fascinating thing is the ink is actually sensitive to heat, and it goes away because of the friction and heat created. So you're not actually creating like those little eraser pieces. It goes away. It's as nice to write with as it is to erase with. And it's just a super good piece of design.
I'm going to have to try one. Okay, good. So we'll keep those in mind as we talk. The first piece that I wanted to talk about is the Atkinson Hyperlegible. And I'm going to ask you to describe it, but I think that what's interesting is you did it with the Braille Institute.
Yes.
The big insight, meaning the big issue for them, was that they're known for people who are blind, right? And so we all know about Braille, we all know about the Braille Institute, and that's basically what they're known for, people who are legally blind and fully blind. And yet, the bigger issue today are people who have vision issues. And so people who just aren't blind and not legally blind, but see things not as legibly as they should or as they might. And so you had to challenge a bunch of basic assumptions in order to do what you did. So let's describe what you did, talk about the project, where you came out and where it stands today. Because I think it's so fascinating, and I hope everybody will look it up. Everybody, look it up.
The Braille Institute, as you said, I mean, their name is Braille, right? So you immediately understand what they do. It's telegraphic. They're a 100-year organization. They're actually 100-year plus now. And we were retained by them for a branding project, of all things. And the reason that they retained us, or that they were looking to kind of update their brand, was that people with low vision were more and more engaging with them for their services. So basically what that means is, like, if you start to have very significant vision loss, they have classes that help you kind of understand how to kind of maneuver with this new condition. So, simple things like how to organize your kitchen, to strategies for being able to tell different currency apart, because the US currency, all the bills are the same size. So what's the difference between a 1, a 10, a 20, and a 100? And just those types of things.
I've been trying to teach my kids that forever.
Yeah, it's a hard thing to do. So so they needed to basically, on their 100-year anniversary, get people to understand that it wasn't just about Braille and people who had total vision loss. It was a vast majority of the people they served were people with low vision. And they didn't want to abandon their Braille roots, because they're still very much advocates in that space. I mean, that's how they started the Institute, was they wanted to make Braille literacy. They wanted people to be able to read Braille who needed it, but they also wanted to make it affordable, because it was incredibly expensive to produce a publication with a Braille printer. So that's what they did. So the question was just kind of like, how do we not walk away from who we are? Because it's still an incredibly important part of what we do. But how do we get people to understand that we're here for them when it comes to low vision issues? And that was the brief. And they were also coming into their 100-year anniversary, and they were kind of at this point where it's like, things are changing, right? Technology is changing, screen readers are changing. A lot of the things that had been major impediments are starting to go away just by the virtue of technology. And what's our voice in that? Because we're not going to give up our advocacy for this. So what is our voice in this kind of new conversation that's starting to emerge?
And the solution?
Well, the solution was a branding program that repositioned them, that was incredibly, it embraced kind of the contemporary, that vision loss isn't the end, it's the beginning. Like, because this is happening to you, it's not the end of your life, it's the beginning of a new chapter in your life. And the fact that they were dealing with younger constituents, people in their 50s, that this is something that it needed to be more youthful, more vibrant, more accessible to kind of the broad range of people that vision loss was affecting. So we did a complete program, right? An entire program that was super cool. I mean, you should just check it out. I hate to use words to describe it. It used illustration. We came up with a new logo. The logo is actually, when you look at it, it's the lowercase b, and then there's a dot, and that's actually the 0, or the part of the B, there's a dot, and then dot on the I is actually an I in Braille. So it's Braille Institute. It's pretty cool. It was an amazing thing. But we had this insight that as we started to develop it.
Yeah, I think like your Entenmann's example of the cellophane window, the typeface for Braille is the equivalent of that. It's the disproportionately important aspect of the project. I think it did two things really well. One is, so it's a typeface that was created specifically for people with low vision. Most typefaces are quite difficult to read for people with low vision. So imagine that you can only see in parts of your vision, not the whole thing. It's not blurry, you just only see some parts. Most typefaces have very regular letters, that the shapes are very harmonious. They're very similar across the typeface. That's what gives it its style. And for hundreds of years, that's the trend and the way of creating typefaces. But if you have low vision and you can only see parts at a time, an L, a lowercase l, uppercase I can look identical. So what we had to do was create letter differentiation. So we create a whole typeface that's completely different than most typefaces, but looks on the surface to be very similar to most typefaces, but it's very effective. It did two things. It helped people realize that if there's a typeface for Braille, it's not only the dots and people who cannot see, it's people who can see but not see that well. And then the other thing it did was it positioned them as an innovator, someone changing the discussion in the space of low vision. And I think that.
And so where does it stand today? Is the typeface in use? So people.
Yeah, it's freely available. I think the other thing, just to kind of back up, is as we were developing the corporate identity system, what we were realizing is as we were looking for type, that we couldn't, we just couldn't in good conscience specify a typeface that was hard to read. And there just wasn't anything really on the market that was and it was an interesting brief, right? Because like I was telling you, this is about a contemporary organization, right? It's about moving them into the future. So it had to be aesthetically pleasing, but it also had to be highly legible. And as Craig was alluding to, if you start looking at Helvetica and you start looking at these benchmarks of type that are absolutely stunning, what you really begin to realize very quickly is they're not the best thing for somebody with low vision.
So what we have here is a design program
Correct.
that's centered around a brief for a refresh of a brand.
Correct.
And then much like the cellophane window, you drove it also into creating a typeface that solved a major problem, but that became part of the brand.
Yeah, but it wasn't the brief. That was kind of the coolest. I mean, it became obvious in the project that they didn't come to us and said, develop a font. What they came to us for was, we need a new logo. We need a new brand. And in going through that process with them and hearing what they were about and becoming sensitive to who they were going to be speaking to. And as we started to develop, you've got your type, you got your logo, you got your colors, basically. We started to realize that one of those major components of a typical branding program was going to fall short for the people who needed it most, and that was people with low vision. So then so it's like, bing, all of a sudden, let's design a typeface, which was the most ridiculous thing you could ever say because it's insanely difficult to do. And then that became a major part of the program because it showed the sensitivity of them to who's coming to their centers, but then it also reignited the conversation in the marketplace as advocates for people with low vision.
For people who don't see, right?
So to go back to your other question, it's freely available. You can download. It's been included in the Google font library.
Right.
So you can set it to be your default typeface in any of the Google platform, which is pretty amazing. And then it's also available for full download on their website. They own it. It's completely free to use. So
Great. So I hope everybody's paying attention to that.
Yeah.
Completely free to use. Download it from Google. It's available. And it's something that should be in everybody's consciousness. I mean, it's really pretty cool. So let's move to what may be one of the biggest design programs. And biggest, I don't mean necessarily big because of its complexity. We've all been involved in big programs that required lots and lots of rebranding on planes and buildings and trucks and whatever. I myself have been involved in stuff like that. But I think big from a point of view of global focus, of emotion, of optimism, of change. And I'm talking about the World Trade Center. And we happen to be right now in Silverstein Studios, which is in Tower 7, World Trade Center 7, amazing building. We're in the center of everything that's happening down here. We call it the New York Renaissance. It's amazing. But on 9/11, tragedy struck, and this whole plaza became a barren wasteland. And there were many people who thought it would never come back. Larry Silverstein felt differently. He had the vision, thank God. And he conceived in his head what it looks like today. It's actually pretty amazing when you think about it, that he literally, on that day, realized that he was going to rebuild down here, and that it was important to rebuild. Fast forward 10 years, they start the rebuilding. They start the actual rebuilding after going through years and years and years of holdups and issues. The plaza, the Memorial Plaza, which is incredible, and one of my very close friends' names is there. I go all the time just to stand there and look, which is an incredible space and sort of anchors everything that we do down there, was inaugurated. And you guys get hired to brand something that not everybody was ready for, something that some people were actually scared of. Mm-hmm. And you needed to brand it in a way that would let us all know it was exciting, it was here and future looking, and it was all about optimism.
I think when we started that project, we had an advantage over everyone else who was bidding for it, because some of us had worked on the 9/11 memorial identity. The sort of the reverence and remembrance part was already taken care of in our minds. So we could focus very much on the rebuilding, the much more commercial side of it. And I think that freed us from the sort of burden of having to tell the entire story. We could focus clearly on the commercial story, just as Larry was when he was envisioning it. And I think that
But you did, but reverence was a part of your thinking, though.
Yeah, it is absolutely. It's in the spectrum, but it's not the whole story. I think
Right.
at the time, most people, the whole story was still about
Reverence.
the tragedy.
Right. So how'd you approach it?
I think we were really naive about how we approached it, to be honest with you. I mean, look, we talked about this a little bit earlier. I mean, we started the project when we were at Landor, which you mentioned. And as Craig said, he had worked, he was being a bit modest. He had worked on the 9/11 memorial identity. And the Port Authority basically put out a typical RFP to start looking for the identity for the commercial side of the project. And I think we set out, it was an interesting project because we set out, I think, in a very kind of a traditional mindset of how to approach a branding program, right? It was kind of like, I hate to say it, but I think we had a preconceived notion of where we wanted to take it, and we were going to do, it was a very kind of standard thing. It was like, we're going to do interviews, and we're going to do this, and then we're going to go through the identity mark, and then we're going to go through stakeholder, review, and
You do the usual.
Do the usual. And that's how we started it. And then I would say within 1 month we realized that wasn't going to work. And we completely changed the way that we approached how we did the branding. And I think it was the first time where, as a designer, even though I'm generally a strategy general manager, my background's actually design. It was my first time as a designer where I kind of came to realize what our real role is, and that's to use our skills to be able to bring kind of the vision of who we're working for to life. And I think a lot of times what happens in design is it's like you have your vision and you want to make that the vision of your client. And that's the art side of it. And for me, it was this huge moment where I was like, wait a second, our job is really to use all of our skills as communicators and designers and aestheticists and whatever it happens to be to bring that to bear on helping our client get this thing back to where it needed to be with a lot of different stakeholders. And
you had a lot of stakeholders.
A ton of stakeholders, yeah.
Including Century 21, when you think about it. I mean, basically everybody in this area.
Everybody. I mean, basically South Canal. But then you had your direct stakeholders. You had the Port Authority who owns the property, right? I mean, it's an incredibly complex commercial site. So you have the Port Authority who actually owns the land. You have, Silverstein, who is basically operating 3 of the buildings. Don't quote me on that. I don't have the numbers on the top of my head anymore. But they're operating buildings. You have Durst, who's One World Trade Center. You have the PAC. I'm pointing because I can see it right in front of us. The Performing Arts Center. You have the Transit Hub, which is the Calatrava building, which is operated by Westfield and Port Authority. And then, of course, in the heart of it all, you have the memorial pools, and you have the museum as well. So they were all stakeholders. They were direct stakeholders. Then you had the city of New York. You had the state of New York, because the thing about the Port Authority is it's a bi-state agency. So it basically is operated between New Jersey and New York. So at the time, you had 2 state governors who are larger than life, who operate the Port Authority. Then you had Community Board 1, which is an incredibly vocal residency group of Lower Manhattan, so because you're now adjacent to one of the, to Battery Park City, and also what's happening is, like you said, it's like the Renaissance. So we're starting to see a huge shift to residential tenants in Lower Manhattan, which was historically always commercial tenants, but because of the building stock, now you have a lot of people coming in who are residents. So Community Board 1 is involved. Then, it's like the list goes on and on and on. Then you've got, at the time, Mayor Bloomberg's Art Council. You've got DOT. It just was an immense.
Which I was on, by the way.
Yeah.
And so I saw a lot of the design because we saw it as commissioners as part of the arts and culture. We saw that.
And then the other part that you can't, that was so incredibly important was victims' families, survivors, and the whole 9/11 memorial community. So. And
what about Leibskin? Did he play a role in the?
I mean, he played a role. We didn't meet with him, but I mean, his work was the foundation by which we basically developed everything. So just so people know, Daniel Leibskin came up with the master plan for the World Trade Center. It's a beautiful master plan, and it's unbelievable that it was built. I mean, so often these master plans are developed and then they just kind of don't happen. And it kind of, you asked an earlier question about what gets the iPod or the Entenmann's package in the market. It's bravery and it's conviction, right? It's like, and I think that in the World Trade Center, especially with the execution of that master plan, there are a lot of people who stuck by their guns and had the bravery to not waver on what that vision was. And so in so much as we use that as, our foundation for everything that was done.
You needed to align all these people.
That's
what
correct.
Was that like?
It was kind of, this is where it shifted in my head from being the way we would normally, quote unquote, run a branding project to kind of a civic project. It was a lot of listening. And it was a lot of just putting your own thoughts to the side. It was hard because you have your own point of view, but
right. I think the way you described it in one place was you had to compromise, not impose.
That's correct. I wouldn't even call it compromise. I would say we had to listen and articulate, not impose what we wanted to do.
Yeah, often as a designer, you sort of instinctively have an early idea, which you mentioned earlier, and then it sort of feels like the job is to articulate that and then convince other people, your client, that it's the right idea. But in this case, there was just so much input from ever increasingly important people in the process that in a way we sort of naturally turned into just a vessel for communicating back all the things that we heard, but just distilled down into some simple ideas. So I sort of, the ego fades away. You're very much driven by this idea that the world is watching, and as New Yorkers, we have very high expectations that we've got to make something that really works, that is beautiful, that is amazing. You're driven by that, but also driven by what people are telling you, and how can you include that in your thinking?
So I'm going to ask everybody, again, go do your homework. There's a lot of video around this, and you should all look it up because it's amazing, and you'll just see the work. But the mark that you came up with is very identifiable. We all know it. We've all seen it. I think what amazed me as I studied it in preparation just for talking with you guys, which is just such an honor, I hadn't realized the layers of thinking. And I guess I should have. It's like how many people see the arrow in FedEx, right? I mean, it's always there in great design, great logo design. There's always a layer of something. There's something we don't see. But I hadn't really seen all the layers. And I think once I went through it and went back over it a few times, I was just amazed. So I'm just going to ask you about one piece because we can't see it, so it's hard to take it all apart. Talk about the 1776, because that, to me, was the pièce de résistance of the whole thing.
Yeah, it was a really brilliant insight. Elliot Scott, who works for us as well as he was the
Who's no relationship to
no
Brad
relationship
Scott.
to me whatsoever.
Although you both have beards.
Although we look identical. So, but he was the one who had the idea, and it drives through the whole system. So this idea of 17.76 degrees, and it was actually it's symbolized like it's the trajectory up, right? And it's up and to the right. I mean, that's where you always want to be going. We're heading up and to the right, and we're heading at that degree. Obvious connection to the founding of our country, right? 1776, and also a nod to One World Trade Center, which is the tallest building in the northern hemisphere. So, and that's at 1776 as well. So it is kind of it's a fun little thing, but it isn't just. I mean, its symbolism is significant and important, but then it also went on to become a major element in the rest of the system. It was a mechanism that we could use to basically tie together all the stakeholders. Like we use that angle of optimism, right? That's what we call it, the angle of optimism, which is 17.76 degrees, to harmonize across multiple stakeholders. Because the World Trade Center identity at its core was really to serve the stakeholders. It was to serve Silverstein, it was to serve Durst, it was to serve the Port Authority. And that meant that in a lot of cases, like in the case where we're sitting today, like Seven World Trade Center had its own identity and it had its own marketing material and all these things that identify it as an individual building. It had to work in harmony with that work and not say, oh no, now you've got to you have to become World Trade Center. No, it's 7 World Trade Center, and World Trade Center, and part of World Trade Center is 7 World Trade Center. So that it had to be able to let things come forward and go back, right? So if 7 World Trade Center needed to come forward, we needed to have a mechanism to allow it to do it, so that the World Trade Center piece, the campus itself, could kind of step back and let it go forward. And in cases where we needed the campus to step forward, it could step forward. And it's that line that kind of helps to do that.
And like all great design, we started talking about pencils, but like all great design, I don't need to know that it's 17.76 degrees. No. But the truth is that when you look at it, you do get that sense of trajectory, and you do get that sense of optimism.
I want to go back to so you picked that as the thing that felt important to you. What was amazing about the identity that Elliot created was each stakeholder that we went back to and reviewed it with them, they each gravitated to one particular aspect that felt most important to them.
That's great.
So the fact that it has 6 or 7 different meanings in total is not actually the most important thing. The most important thing is that it has a meaning for each person. It's not the same for each person, but some people that worked at the Port Authority and actually worked in the building, they see the trident shape, which was it was the lower floors, the motif of the design. They see that. Silverstein sees the 17.76, or just the feeling that new buildings are rising out of the ground. People that were more connected to the memorial see the pools in the negative shape. So everybody sees the thing they need to see to believe in it. And I think that's the genius of the logo.
But it all comes together, as all good things do, to symbolize the totality.
Yeah.
Well, the beauty of it is you can walk by it and not need to know it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But
but I know what it is.
You do, because you're interested in it, right? It's the beginning of a dialogue, and I think that's what all good design is. I mean, I think we're kind of crazy to think as designers we give ourselves a higher purpose in the world. We think we're more important than we actually are, right? I think real good design doesn't have to you can engage with it and just appreciate the fact that it works, or that it just kind of adds to your day. Or if you want to, you can engage in the dialogue about it, right? I mean, the pencil thing, and it's funny you hit on that. I'm a fanatic about pencils, and I can sit here and tell you all about pencils because I'm interested in pencils. But I can also hand a pencil to somebody and all they have to do is use it and it works. Right? They don't have to know all of the things we talked about pencils. And I think that's what's so awesome about the World Trade Center market is you don't have to know all the symbolism to appreciate kind of what it does when you walk by it on the site, for example, or how it helps to promote the economic development of Lower Manhattan, Like you can it's there. Like you can walk by it and not have to notice it. And I think what happens a lot with design is you try to pack too much into it and beat you over the head, and then people sit there, you kind of are left scratching your head going, what does that thing really mean? And the strongest pieces are the ones where you don't have to know what it means to see it, but if you want to know more, you can. And it starts that kind of dialogue around what the issues are that drove its purpose.
Thank you. That was amazing. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah.
Brad, Craig, it was great discussion, and we're going to talk more about, we're going to do some more content around the World Trade Center, what you've done. I think, again, from my personal perspective, I'm down here every day. I feel the Renaissance. I'm in the Silverstein Towers. I just love being here because you can feel the energy. And when I look at the design that you guys do, it speaks to me. It speaks to the energy and the optimism. So I thank you for that, and we look forward to a lot more great work coming out of applied design. One thing we'll keep our eye on, and maybe we'll get you back here in a year to talk about it, is what's happening underground at Grand Central Station.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I have been in the tunnels. I was taken through, and I saw the huge earth movers and the big core, and it was like from freaking Dante's Inferno.
It's amazing.
Some of it, and it's really, really amazing.
Yes, the scale is epic.
And that's going to be another piece of New York that you guys are going to help define for us. And so that's something we'll hold out for another day, because I think that in and of itself is just such a great topic, and one that I'd like to explore more with you. But again, I thank you, and to all of our watchers, all the listeners, thank you for having listened, for having joined us. Creativity from the Other Side, brought to you by New York Festivals with Brad Scott and Craig Dobie of Applied Design. Thank you so much, and here's what I leave you with: the pencil. Think about the brilliance next time you pick up a pencil. And if you don't have one, God damn it, go buy one. You should have a pencil. Come on. Go get a pencil, hold it, and think about the brilliance of that design. And then just let your mind go to everything else in your world and think about all of the design that you see. And think about the discussion that we just had and pay attention to design. So David Sable, coming to you from Silverstein Studios and Tower 7 of the World Trade Center, which we just talked about. And thank you.